The subject of my talk tonight, as advertised, is the alchemical secrets of the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, Rhodes, Malta, Cyprus, let's see, where else? And to sort of even approach that topic, we have to kind of move around the edges first. And the first thing we sort of have to explain is alchemy. Now, alchemy, to most people, is this funny pseudoscience, a forerunner of chemistry, and all these guys puffing away, trying to turn lead into gold and not really knowing what they're doing. That's one aspect. And some people did know what they were doing, and that sort of physical transmutation of lead into gold is apparently possible. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But there are two other things that we can call alchemy, and they're all part of the same bundle of concepts. The second type of alchemy is personal transcendence or personal transmutation. And that's something that's more notably discussed in Eastern tradition like Tibetan Buddhism, where you find masters like Padmasambhava or Guru Rinpoche who actually attained what is called a diamond body. That is, his plasma field, as Dan would say, became so coherent that he no longer had to die and could live forever, etc. So that sort of personal transmutation is one of the aspects. Then the third aspect is transmuting time and human society from the base metal of the Iron Age into a more perfect golden age. Now, these last two are not necessarily discussed together, and it's very rare to find all three of these aspects of alchemy grouped together. But we're all describing the same process, just from different perspectives and with different applications. So having said that, to sort of give you a little bit of a setup, let me say that what we're going to talk about tonight is a tale of two alchemists. You've probably heard of a tale of two cities. Well, this is a tale of two alchemists. It's also a tale of two revolutions, the Hermetic Revolution in the 16th century and the French Revolution in the 18th century. Also the American Revolution, but we'll kind of jump over that. Now, these two revolutions are sort of like bookends that created the modern world that we live in at the moment. The first Hermetic Revolution was the first New Age movement in which science began and the toehold, the iron grip of the church began to slip. And then the French Revolution is sort of the end of the process in which all of the old social orders, from the church to the nobility to the feudal system, were dissolved, were sort of torn apart, you might say. So we can see these two revolutions as sort of bookends, and the two great figures in both of them are alchemists. The great figure in the Hermetic Revolution, at least in Central Europe, was a fellow by the name of Edward Kelly. Now, both of these two alchemists we're going to talk about were sort of known in their lifetime by their detractors as charlatans, scam artists, con artists, mountebanks, frauds, fakes, imposters, and generally all around people that you probably wouldn't want to invite to dinner. However, there is an old Sufi saying, and since we're on an island that speaks a variety of Arabic, we'll just go Sufi on you. There is an old Sufi saying that says you're not a saint unless 400 wise men have reviled you. So by that case, Kelly and our second alchemist, who we'll talk about in a moment, are definitely saints. Edward Kelly arrived in Prague, which in the late 1580s was the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, which of course was neither Roman nor holy, but was an empire in Central Europe, Germany, northern Italy. And they arrived in Prague because the emperor at that point, a fellow by the name of Rudolph II, was truly obsessed with all things magic, mysterious, and alchemical. Now, we'll have a look at Rudolph here. This is Rudolph. Now, Dean Kelly arrived on what can only be called an apocalyptic missionary journey, in the sense that the angels had told them to go preach the end of the world to the important people of Europe, particularly the emperor. Angels, oh, okay. Well, that's a longer story. John Dee was sort of the Einstein of the 16th century. As a young man, he had written the grand unified field theory of the 16th century, a book called the Monad Hieroglyphicus. Now, the monad, as we'll call it for short, is one of these symbolic representations of all knowledge. And it's pretty good for the mid-16th century. It combines sacred geometry with concepts that, when we apply them mathematically, describe some of the qualities of the fourth mathematical dimension. That's pretty good for someone who hadn't even, for a mathematician that didn't even know calculus. That's pretty good stuff. So Dee had arrived at what he considered to be the high point of human knowledge and decided to bump it up a notch and talk to higher intelligence. Now, in his worldview, that higher intelligence were angels. So he had been lucky enough during one of his continental adventures during the writing of the Monas Hieroglyphica to stumble across a book that described in code how you contact angels. So he tried this out with the aid of a scrying stone. Now, a scrying stone is just your normal crystal ball, except here's his collection of scrying stones. This is the crystal ball here. Now, this crystal ball was apparently, according to several sources, given to him by the angels themselves. So, fairly special. Now, he tried it first on his footman, and his footman was immediately so freaked out by the experience that he left Dee's employ, thereby losing him a good servant, but no loss in the overall picture. A few months later, a colorful figure by the name of Edward Kelly, which was not his real name, he introduced himself under the name of Edward Talbot and later became Edward Kelly, but probably neither of those was the name he was born under. He had a fake horoscope, which showed him to be at least 10 years younger than he actually was. Definitely a colorful character. Now, he showed up at Dee's door to try to sell him a mysterious powder of projection, which we'll get back to, and a manuscript in an unknown language that we now believe is the Voynich manuscript. Now, Dee, of course, was interested in both of these objects, but what he was most interested in was Edward Talbot Kelly's claim to be able to see things in the crystal. So immediately Dee latched onto this and said, okay, if you can see things, that means we can really talk to the angels. And there began 8 years of almost daily conversation with these angelic intelligences. Now, if you're looking for proof of higher intelligence, then these 8 years worth of angelic sessions are the ultimate. Because in those sessions, the angels delivered a language that seems to be directly coded to our DNA, a language of light, for want of a better phrase, as well as higher dimensional geometries that have only been mathematically described in the last 50 years. Now, if you look through all the literature of psychicism, all the UFO literature, etc., only rarely do you find anything that approaches proof that the communication was with some sort of higher or different intelligence. And at the top of that very short list is Dee and Kelly's angelic sessions. Now, the angels gave Dee and Kelly several fairly accurate prophecies and sent them off to Europe to spread the good word that the end of the world was just around the corner and that everyone should prepare for the new age. Oh, does that sound familiar? So off they go to Europe, and they didn't have much luck in Poland, although Dee, of course, ended up with lots of Kabbalistic manuscripts and books. And they arrived in Prague, and Rudolph was overjoyed to see the mysterious book in a mysterious language that no one could read with all the strange pictures, the Voynich manuscript. And he was really intrigued by the idea that they might actually have the fabled powder of projection. Now let me stop there and explain just a bit more about physical alchemy. Now, if you look at the similarity in atomic structure between mercury and, for instance, gold, they're very close. They're so close that if you could find some way to catalyze what we would now think of as fusion, then you could essentially expand mercury into gold. But what would be the model that would do that? Turns out that there are some very interesting models. And the most interesting of all those models goes all the way back to ancient Egypt. Now, in the Middle Ages, there was something in every apothecary shop across Europe called mummy dust. Now, mummy dust was sort of the universal snake oil panacea of its day. It was prescribed for everything. All of your troubles could be cured if you just simply had enough mummy dust. Well, it depends on when your mummy was mummified, how good your mummy dust was. Because the mummies from the pre-dynastic kingdoms and the Old Kingdom seem to have a larger proportion of gold. And that gold was of a peculiar sort of monatomic quality that, taken in small doses, almost homeopathic doses, would have an effect on your immune system. So the question is, how did the ancient Egyptians stumble on the secret of transmutation? Now, turns out that, 20 million years ago or so, a large meteorite struck the desert west of what would become the Nile Valley. And this meteorite vaporized a whole savanna and a shallow lake bed and turned it into a type of salt called natron. And it also left fragments like this of meteoritic glass. Now, 95% of all meteorites that strike the Earth are nickel iron, but 5% have a silica composition that we would call glass. And the glass is fused under tremendous heat and pressure as it comes through our atmosphere. Some of that glass, maybe 1% of that 5%, have heavy metals in them. Now, this particular piece of meteoritic glass from the western oasis in Egypt has beryllium in it, and that's why it's such a beautiful yellow color. Now, apparently, the beryllium and a very low-yield gamma radiation, over time and with the proper electromagnetic and telluric alignments, and the proper focus of the priest maintaining the cult of the dead person, would produce this very interesting form of gold. The physical flesh of the mummy would begin to turn into mummy dust, and in that mummy dust would be little flakes of what we would now sort of describe as monatomic gold. Now, we don't really know for sure whether the ancient Egyptians knew enough to turn that particular piece of science into a large-scale alchemical process. But the very word alchemy, alchem, the black, points to Egypt, since Egypt was known as the land of the black along the Nile Valley, and the red, the desert. So the very name alchemy harkens back to Egypt. However, by the 1st century BCE, there was a group of scientists in Alexandria who formalized what we would think of as the philosophy of alchemy. Whether they actually performed transmutations or not, we really don't know. However, there seemed to have been an awful lot more gold in ancient Egypt than there were gold mines to mine it out of. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, the secret of alchemy between, say, the 1st century and the 11th century seems to have been something that was on again, off again. We have a few records of transmutations, but nothing really spectacular and nothing really documented. And then something truly unusual happened, the First Crusade. And as the outcome of the successful First Crusade, the King of Jerusalem, Baldwin II, needed a police force. And he turned to some local knights who were living on Mount Zion, who had been sent there 100 years before by the alchemical Pope Sylvester II as a chronicling order, an order to gather information and write down history. And apparently they were the only organized military force in Jerusalem other than the Crusaders themselves, most of whom had looted all they needed out of the fall of Jerusalem and were on their way home. So the largest group of dedicated knights became the militia of Christ, and in a few years, with an influx of people from Europe, they would become the Knights Templars. Now, the first things the Knights Templars did, even though they were charged with protecting the pilgrims, was to begin to dig like crazy under Solomon's temple. Now, Solomon's temple on Temple Mount is different from Mount Zion. That's a slight shift, but Mount Zion is where David conducted the first sacrifices to the Lord. That's the threshing field where he danced. Temple Mount may have been where Solomon built the huge temple. It may only have been the place where Herod built his temple. However, turns out that there was a mad caliph involved in all of this. Now, of course, Islam had conquered the whole region in the 7th century and had dissolved into warring factions. The Sunnis, who were the Orthodox, think Catholic Muslims, and the Shia, who were the followers of the family of the Prophet, think Cathars Muslims. And they were fighting it out over many centuries. And it just turned out that a small group of Shia, called the Ismailis, raided Mecca and stole the most prized relic in the Kaaba, or the sacred stone, the meteorite. Now, the meteorite dates from Abraham. When Abraham became Abraham from Abram, he made a covenant with some sort of angry god that sent him a flaming meteor or flaming fireball down the center of his sacrifices. And the tradition is that that flaming meteorite became the stone in the Kaaba. Well, in the 9th century, these crazy Ismailis raided Mecca and stole the stone. And 2 centuries later, when it was returned, roughly 60% of the stone had disappeared. Now, one of the few people that we know who had a piece of the stone was our mad caliph's grandfather. So apparently, the caliph kept a piece, and he was on the Fatimid side. He was a follower of the Shia, the family of Muhammad. Again, think Cathars. And he passed it on to his son and then his grandson. Now, his grandson, El-Hakim II, went a little bit crazy, and we don't really have any reason in the historical records for him going crazy. But he first tried to embrace Christianity, then rejected Christianity. He first tried to make war on the Sunnis, then embraced the Sunnis. And he had all sorts of other rather peculiar beliefs, such as the fact that he thought that he was the Mahdi, or the prophet returned at the end of time. So El-Hakim II was not wrapped too tight. However, he's the one who gave permission to Pope Sylvester II for the Order of Chronicling Knights to be established in the old Greek Basilica on Mount Zion. He's also the last known person to have his grandfather El-Mansur's piece of the stone. And the tradition is that he left a great treasure under the temple, which would have been Herod's temple, also the Dome of the Rock, and marched east out into the desert toward the Red Sea and disappeared. Now, all of this history would have been well known to the chroniclers on Mount Zion. They would have known all about El-Hakim the Mad and his magic piece of stone. So what makes this stone so important? Remember, this stone is one of those 5% that are meteoritic glass. And its deep wine red-purple color indicates that it wasn't impregnated with something like beryllium, that it had what we would call the platinum group metals. Palladium, gold, platinum. Probably palladium, given its color. Infused within it so richly and so strongly that the chunk of it that ended up in the Kaaba was a deep wine red. Now, this platinum group metal in the meteorite seems to be the prima materia. Now, there's good scientific reasons for that, which I'm sure Dan will share with you in the course of the next few days. But it's a really novel idea to think that, okay, it may have been just that simple. However, the last known alchemist, a guy by the name of Fulcanelli, or at least his pseudonym, was known to have been experimenting with putting palladium, infusing palladium in the gas, the natural gas, coal tar gas, being burned in the streetlights of Paris circa 1914, 1915. And at the gasworks, he was able to transform lead into gold. So it's like, okay, our last known alchemist was experimenting with this. There are good chemical and atomic reasons why this would work. And we have a big chunk of stone that drives people crazy, and these crazy knights who go crazy digging for it. They dig for 10 or 15 years. They discover something. They take it back to Europe. They have the brightest minds, including the best Kabbalists they can find, examine it, and before you can say, hey, presto, they are blackmailing the Pope into making them the official sort of policeman of the church. And they're also creating everything that we would now think of as banking and credit cards. In other words, if you were going on crusade, you could sell all your goods in England, deposit it in the temple. The temple would give you a coded message, and when you got to Palestine, you could hand that coded message to the guy at the temple, and he would give you gold. Where did the gold come from? If it's too dangerous for crusaders, huge armies of armed men, to carry gold from England to Palestine, then how did the gold get to Palestine? Puzzle. So it appears that the Templars had the secret, and that the secret was this meteoritic glass that could be prepared in a certain way to produce what was known as the powder of projection. And we can think of that as the catalyst that encourages base metals to jump an electron shell and become gold, or a perfect dodecahedral fractal structure. Fractal, in case Dan gets too excited to explain it, is an object, an idea, or an image that looks exactly the same, very, very large and very, very small. There's a regular, repeatable pattern that encompasses all scales. The ratio remains the same, the scale changes. Okay? So, having this secret, the Templars proceeded to sort of rule Europe for 200 years. Oops, they lost the Holy Land. No problem, we'll just make more gold. Now they screwed up by performing a literal transmutation in front of witnesses that included the future Pope and the future King of France. Now these two rather nefarious individuals sort of colluded on the idea that, well, maybe the Templars are kind of passé, maybe they've outlived their usefulness, and oh, by the way, we could really use that gold. So, of course, the Templars were declared heretics. They were all arrested on Friday the 13th, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, Jacques de Molay, the Grandmaster of the Templars, when he was burned, said that the king and the Pope would both have to account for their deeds, and that they would be dead within a year. And they were. Now, the interesting point in our little twist here is that most of the Templar properties, Templar archives, Templar information, particularly in southern France, Provence, transferred directly to the Knights of St. John. Now, the Knights of St. John are one of the strange orders that cropped up in the follow-through of Sylvester II's chroniclers. The cover story about a poor knight from Provence who decides that he wants to offer help and hospitality and cure the suffering of pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land really doesn't hold water historically. Yes, they were in the Holy Lands before the Crusades, and yes, during the more liberal period, say 50 years before the Crusades, they had open hospitals all across southern France and all across the Holy Land. But they don't seem to have originated in Provence with the cover story. It seems to be one of these groups of chroniclers sent to Provence who, on Sylvester II's orders, were looking into something very particular. And what they were looking into is the whole idea of how do you survive? How do you create a elixir of everlasting life, for want of a better word? The healing panacea. And in fact, it's among the Knights of St. John that you find some of the earliest mention of our medieval mummy dust. Okay? So before the Crusades, they were already there. They would have been in contact with the chroniclers on Mount Zion. And after the Templars came crashing down, they became the repository of the Templar archives, and at least a small portion of, perhaps the most significant proportion of, the Templar secrets. Now, how we know this brings us to the late 15th century, the late 1400s. And there was a very curious fellow by the name of George Ripley. He was an Englishman, very bright Englishman, and one of the earliest chemists. He claimed to have found documents from Roger Bacon that pointed him in the direction of the secrets of alchemy. Oh, and by the way, the direction in which those secrets of alchemy lay were to the island of Malta. So George Ripley was here in the late 15th century, had some sort of conversations, we don't know much about him, and he left very little records, with the Grandmaster of the Order of St. John, and came up with the main current of what in the next century would become the next verifiable stage in alchemical transmutation. Now, let's circle back to our charming con man, Edward Kelly. Edward Kelly's powder of projection, he claimed, came to him from Glastonbury Abbey, where George Ripley, who studied alchemy on Malta, had hidden it 50 years before. So, here's Edward Kelly. He's in Prague. He has the powder of projection. He thinks it's going to work. They put their neck on the line with Rudolph, saying, okay, this is going to work. Guess what? Doesn't work. One of the problems with the powder of projection is that it's extremely volatile. You have to make sure that nothing touches it, or it will automatically start this catalytic process. So somewhere along the line between Ripley and Kelly, someone touched the powder of projection. And when it came around time to do something truly amazing in Prague, it wouldn't work. So here's where the story gets even more interesting. Turns out that Prague and the whole of Bohemia was formed by, can you guess it? A meteorite strike 120 million years ago. And guess what kind of meteorite it was? A silica-based glass meteorite. Has anybody ever seen any moldavite? That nice green. Ah, there's some people that even have it on. All right. Moldavite is one type of meteoritic glass that exploded to the east and southeast from the Prague explosion. Now, Bohemia itself is a ring of mountains thrown up by the huge meteorite crater. And Prague and its 7 hills are like the little crucible inside the bigger bowl. You'll see some of those in Dan's illustrations. And Prague itself, the point of impact of this meteorite, is impregnated with meteoritic glass. The impact was so intense that the granite, the gneiss, the bedrock in Prague melted into slag and reformed. So one of the later alchemists, Michael Meyer, drew pictures of all this in his Atlantis Fugens, and you can actually see one of these drawings in which the two philosophers are walking in Rudolph II's garden, and the philosopher's stone is in the tree, it's in the air, it's in the river, it's in the garden, it's under their feet, it's everywhere. And that's literally true in Prague. It's everywhere. Now, we don't really know how Edward Kelly stumbled onto the fact that Prague was formed by this meteorite strike. It was sort of a common myth. In fact, if you remember your Grail legends, the Parzival of Wolfram von Eichenbach describes the Grail as the great green stone that was pried loose from Lucifer's crown and fell to earth. Now, Wolfram, in his earlier days, was a mercenary knight for Ottokar II, who was the king of Bohemia, and actually spent a good deal of time in Prague, where he would have heard the green stone story, because it was the main legend of the early Primsilids, the dynasty of Ottokar. So we don't really know how that legend got transformed and given to Kelly, but somewhere along the line he discovered the secret. And the secret was, out of certain sands, out of certain glass, out of certain stones that contained this really weird kind of blue, ultraviolet, radiant form of moldavite, you could create the prima materia. So in December 1586, Kelly performed the first transmutation, and he was very careful, since he had had his ears chopped off for faking it 20 years or so before. He was very careful to make sure that he did it in front of witnesses, handed the crucible around, let everybody look at it as instruments, so there's no fakery involved. And sort of instantly, he became the superstar at the court of Rudolph II. Over the next 2 years, Kelly did 2 more transmutations in front of the court treasurer, the fellow who assayed the quality of gold, and one perhaps in front of Rudolph himself, although we can't quite be sure of that. So that makes 3 validated transmutations in the late 1580s. Now, just a brief sideline to this. Shakespeare was also along for the ride and was a witness to the December 1586 transmutation. You'll have to wait till my movie comes out in 2 years, then we can talk about the story, but that's just a teaser. Now, Kelly, of course, being such a superstar and having the ear of the emperor, got himself ennobled, became Sir Edward Kelly, got himself a title, and mines, houses, lots of property. Dee went back to England, and with Shakespeare's help, started the English theater and what we would think of as the glories of the Elizabethan age. Kelly stayed in Prague and founded the Hermetic Revolution and the Rosicrucians. Unfortunately, cherchez la femme, as the French say, Kelly had the bad luck to be involved with the Imperial Chancellor's wife, and he got caught at it and was forced into a duel with the Imperial Chancellor's henchman. And Fast Eddie, as he was known in those days, drew first and blew the henchman's head off. And the emperor had specifically prohibited dueling, so Kelly was thrown into prison, tortured on the rack. The records of his torture session are being put to the question, still exist, fascinating reading. And he wouldn't tell him the secret. So after a while, Rudolph relented, turned him loose, and he still wouldn't tell him the secret. A couple of years went by, and he still wouldn't tell him the secret. So Rudolph threw him back into prison. This time, Kelly decided that he'd had enough of prison and tried to escape. His rope wasn't short enough. He fell, broke his right leg really badly, and they cut it off. So Rudolph relented again, turned him loose, but this time the chancellor really had it in for him. Stripped him of all his lands, all his property, and he went back to prison the second time, or the third time if you count their first brief visit at the Prague Castle dungeons. He went back to prison in a little town called Most, and he still didn't like prison. So he tried to escape again, this time through the castle facilities, which overhung the moat. Slipped on the ooze, broke his left leg. They cut it off. And he died either from poison slipped in by his wife or just from his injuries. But he died cursing the city of Most and saying that the city of Most would disappear off the face of the earth, which it did. Now, in Prague, Magister Kelly is a folk hero. There's a movie called The Emperor's Baker or The Baker's Emperor, in which he is a great figure of fun as his charlatan alchemical self. But that's sort of woven into a larger pattern of all this strange stuff in Prague. But Kelly's students, the people that he did tell the secret to, included Michael Sendigovius, a very famous alchemist, and Michael Meyer, Oswald Kroll, and about a half a dozen other prominent figures who would become leaders of the Rosicrucian movement. The Rosicrucian movement actually sort of cropped up about 3-4 years after Kelly's death with the first circulation of the Rosicrucian Manifesto. And inside of 15 years, it had become the hot topic in Europe. Along about this time, Elizabeth has died, and James I ascends to the throne of England and becomes the Protestant protector. I also left out the story of the Spanish Armada. That's in the Shakespeare movie. And James I had a daughter named Elizabeth, and to sort of secure the Protestant movement in Europe, he married her to Frederick, the Elector of the Palatinate. Now, Frederick was in line to be the imperial emperor, to ascend the imperial throne. Now, the empire at that point wasn't a direct dynasty. You needed to be elected. That's why they were electors, okay? So if you had enough family connection, if you had enough pull, you could become elected emperor out of the small body of candidates. So Frederick was one of the candidates. Now, Frederick and Elizabeth's reign in Heidelberg was like something out of one of the Rosicrucian manifestos, like the alchemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. And after 1618, when the Parliament in Prague threw the papal legate and the Spanish ambassador out of the window, it's called Defenestration Day, happened on my birthday, May 23rd. I'm so pleased to have an official Czech holiday on my birthday, I can't tell you. Now, the story is that the Virgin Mary interceded for the papal legate, but truly they just fell in the castle dung heap and weren't injured. But that started the 30 Years' War. Frederick, of course, was elected emperor and failed miserably. And in 1620, a Catholic army marched on Protestant Prague, and it was a disaster. And everybody fled, and the Catholics marched in. And Czechoslovakia, as it used to be, Czech Republic now, Bohemia, we'll just call it Bohemia, that's easier to keep track of, turned back to a Catholic country. So for the next 30 years, the Protestants and the Catholics swept through Bohemia, and both sides just devastated the landscape. It's hard to imagine something on the scale of the 30 Years' War unless you think about the fact that the Second World War lasted 6-7 years, maybe a decade if we include Spain. Imagine that going on 3 times as long with that same ferocity and bloodiness, and you have some idea of the 30 Years' War. After the 30 Years' War, Rosicrucianism was gone, the Hermetic Revolution was over, but there was this new idea called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was the beginning of science, the idea that we could rationally solve mankind's problems, and also, very dear to the Rosicrucians, the idea that humanity could evolve to a new level. Now, the Rosicrucians claimed to be alchemists, but they claimed to be alchemists of a very different sort. And they had nothing good to say about your usual puffers working away with their bellows, vainly trying to turn lead into gold. They were of the opinion that the idea behind alchemy was personal transformation first, and then the transformation of society and time itself. So this idea was very, very potent in the early Enlightenment era, in the late 17th century and the early 18th century. Now let me sort of pause there and do another tangential loop. The single most important political event beside the Spanish Armada, and perhaps even more important in a larger overview, was what happened here in Malta in 1565. Queen Elizabeth I herself said that if Malta fell, the entire Mediterranean would fall to the Ottomans. However, the Knights of St. John had better artillery and a stronger fort and a belief in their own correctness, and were able to fight off the Turks and change the whole tenor of civilization in the Mediterranean. The Turks would, of course, have another century of trying to reach Vienna and marching through the Balkans, but never again would they really challenge the centers of civilization, France, Italy, Spain, etc. So it was the turning point, that point in the 16th century which things shifted. Now, the Knights of Malta, as they were by then, moving from Palestine, etc., by way of Rhodes, etc., and ending up in Malta, they were given Malta by Charles V, whose grandfather, Charles IV, was King of Bohemia. And thereby hangs another weird twist. Before the Knights of Malta ended up in Malta, the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem had their main location, their main commandery, in Prague. And to this day, they still have a Maltese church right across Stone Bridge, or Charles Bridge as we now call it. And this commandery, which I'll show you a picture of, was the reason why all the alchemists started coming to Prague as early as the 14th century, the 1300s. Let me get a good one.
Should I pour you some water, Vincent?
Yes, thank you. I'm getting a little froggy. So here's the Knight of Malta's commandery in Prague. And in fact, some of the stone here when they repaired it in the 18th century, was brought from Malta. So whatever archives that the Knights of Malta had received from the Templars, part of the information at least ended up in Prague. And like I said, from the mid-1300s, the 14th century on, Prague was a magnet for alchemists of all sorts. But it took Fast Eddie Kelly to actually figure it out. Now, as the Knights of Malta lost their reason for being, since they had in fact won out against the Turks and they no longer needed to be the policemen of the Mediterranean, they sort of fell into what we will charmingly call decadence. So by the time of the late 18th century, they were not exactly the Christian Catholic military order that they had once been. Now, assuming that they did have various secrets, including alchemical secrets, it's no surprise that in the middle of the 18th century, we find a fascinating figure by the name of Manuelo Pinto de Fonseca. Now, he was a Grandmaster for 32 years. So long that the local folklore, which I haven't been here long enough to actually check out, this is only from books, please feel free to correct me, thought that he was immortal, perhaps even a vampire. But what we do know about good old Mr. Pinto, or Grandmaster Pinto, was that he had an up-to-date alchemical laboratory up in the gardens just behind the Grandmaster's palace in Valletta. And thereby hangs the story of our second alchemist, who, unlike Kelly, was not interested in physical transmutation. He was interested in transmuting individuals and, more importantly, society. Now, whereas Kelly is a very disreputable figure, at least according to English sources, he's viewed much differently in Prague, Cagliostro, or the Comte de Cagliostro, as he was known, is pretty much derided as a complete charlatan, Montebank, fraud, etc., these days. And that's probably with good reason. He was born in Palermo to a peasant stonecutter and his wife, and he was christened Giuseppe Balsamo. And apparently he was sent off to convent school in Messina, where he fell into bad ways, hanging out with Jewish apothecaries. Ooh. And one of those Jewish apothecaries was a Greek Jew from somewhere in Asia Minor who went under the name of Alphosius. Okay? And Althoas, I'll get that right in a second, was his mentor, and as so Cagliostro claimed, taught him all the secrets of alchemy, magic, the Kabbalah, and etc. Now, this is the story that was pieced together later after Cagliostro's trial for bringing on the French Revolution. Cagliostro himself claimed to be the illegitimate son of Grandmaster Pinto and an Arab princess. That the Grand Knights had conquered an Arab galley with the daughter of the Mufti of Mecca on board, and that they had fallen in love, and that Cagliostro was their love child, and that he was sent to Mecca to be raised by the Mufti, but he never could quite become a follower of Islam. Christianity and the mysteries were too strong. And after wandering through Egypt and Greece and, Sicily for a little while, I had to pick up that Sicilian accent somewhere, he ended up back here in Malta. Well, curiously enough, everyone wants to deride Cagliostro's story, and he did tell some pretty big whoppers from time to time. Just so happens, at the right time period, there are records in the archives of the order of a child who showed up with a mysterious Turkish Oriental merchant and was adopted, assumed as a son or an illegitimate son or as adopted son by Grandmaster Pinto, and was in fact raised in the Grandmaster's palace and departed after about 3 years. No one seems to know where, because that particular individual falls out of the records. But a few years later, when Cagliostro was around 22, 23, he reports coming back to Malta and being received by Pinto as his long-lost son, and with his mentor, actually conducting alchemical experiments in Pinto's alchemical laboratory in the garden up behind the Grandmasters' palace at Valletta. Now, the interesting twist on this is that Cagliostro claimed that his mentor was killed one day in this huge explosion in the alchemical laboratory. And they didn't attain the Philosopher's Stone, but Cagliostro understood that there was more to it, alchemy, than just simply turning base metals into gold. And that's the point in which he was initiated into the secret rites of the knights and became the Conte de Cagliostro instead of just simply Giuseppe Balsamo. Now, whether this is true or a lie, we don't know. We have some evidence that the earlier story of a young child and a mysterious foreign mentor is true, but there's absolutely no evidence of the second story. And it seems rather unlikely that someone who could not prove either their Christianity or their nobility would have been initiated into the Knights of Malta. So we have to kind of doubt that. But the date on that story is very curious, because we do have some really entertaining information about what Grandmaster Pinto and another peculiar figure of the 18th century known as the Comte de Saint-Germain happened to be doing up at the Grandmaster's palace. So let me just kind of divert here for a brief moment and talk about secret societies. In this day and age, we have conspiracies. We were just discussing 9/11 in the car ride from Gozo today. Conspiracies are everywhere. Everybody has their favorite conspiracy. Who shot Kennedy? Who was trying to shoot de Gaulle? How did World War I happen? How did World War II happen? How did we get into such a mess in the Far East? Who's in charge of the price of the dollar versus the euro? Conspiracies everywhere. Rothschilds, did I hear someone say? But the most successful secret society is the one no one's ever heard of. Okay? Ipso facto, if you've heard of it, it's not any good, right? So how would you have a successful secret society? You would have a front organization that was so squeaky clean and Catholic, defenders of the realm, that no one could ever doubt that they were, in fact, a secret society. Which brings us to our second New Age, and the fact that in Europe, particularly Paris and London, from say 1750 on, there was an amazing explosion of what, from our point of view, we can see would be New Age thought. Freemasonry, mesmerism. Okay, how many of you talk about energy? Healing energies, healing waters, electromagnetic spin density. It's all from Mesmer. You know, he came up with it in the 18th century, all right? So this whole burgeoning complex of spiritism, not spiritualism, but spiritism, the idea that there is some élan vital, some life force, that we are all more than just physical beings, that there's some spiritual destiny to humanity. All this comes from the 18th century. The Freemasons were at the fore of this. Now, we won't get into when Freemasons started and who's who and who's what. Let's just say that by 1750, anybody who was anybody in Paris, London, Madrid, Malta was a Freemason, including among the Knights of Malta. Now, the earliest Freemason lodge that we know of on Malta dates from a little later, but there are references in the records that would indicate that there was a lodge of Freemasons here from at least 1750 on, and that they emerged into an organized group in 1788. Now, that organized group that emerged here has direct links with a group that Cagliostro organized in Lyon. And they're all organized around a really odd secret, and that's the secret of St. John. Sometimes called St. John the Baptist, sometimes called St. John the Evangelist, but it's probably a whole different St. John. That's another story. Yeah. Inside this secret society out in the open, like the Knights of Malta, Freemasonry and these New Age ideas began to percolate. And remember, the Grand Master himself has an alchemical laboratory right out behind the palace. In the rules of the Order of the Knights of St. John, alchemy and any magical spiritual practice other than that allowed by the church is strictly forbidden on the pain of death. That didn't slow any of them down. Okay? Other things were prohibited on pain of death, and that didn't slow them down either. Some of our best descriptions from the 18th century from travelers describe Malta as a pretty odd place in which the knights lorded it over the local nobility, pleasure gardens, wine, women, and song. The harbor master would direct you to the great bordellos as soon as you landed. Very interesting Christian stronghold, let's just say, right? So into this atmosphere came all of this New Age ideas, all this new thinking. Now, whether or not Cagliostro actually was Pinto's son, and Cagliostro's influence, and whether he became Cagliostro here in the 1760s, is beside the point. Here's the reason why. In 1770, Pinto and a mysterious figure that some people think is the Comte de Saint-Germain, who has not been seen since 1759, and at that point claimed to be 300 years old, if not literally immortal, and could in fact be our French alchemist Fulcanelli, still alive? We don't know. Pinto and the Saint-Germain organized the secret society to end all secret societies inside the Knights of St. John. They chose 23 candidates from all 8 commanderies and Oriental countries to be part of the group. And the group was initiated at the Grandmasters' palace. And their connections in the future would include a variety of Masonic and other groups, including the Illuminati. Now, the Illuminati were formed to sort of fight the secret society of the Knights of St. John. Weishaupt apparently heard of Pinto's secret society, and since he couldn't join, he decided he would create his own order and wreak havoc, which that came to a very, how should we say, sensational end within a few years. But the Masonic groups that spun off from this 1770 meeting of 23 candidates up the hill at Valletta, the Grandmaster's Palace, produced the groups of Masonry, the groups of Masonic lodges that included both George Washington, Ben Franklin, Voltaire, let me see if I've got everybody, Cornwallis on the British side, the Lafayette, the Prince d'Orléans, and a variety, Comte de Mirabeau, and a variety of French nobility that would later become the leaders of the French Revolution. Now, one of the mysteries is how Napoleon could just sail into the harbor up there and wave his hanky and have the toughest fortress in the Mediterranean go, whoa, we give in. Well, it was due to the fact that the knights at that point, this was 1798, were completely infiltrated by these Masonic lodges that grew out of the secret society of 23 founded by Pinto. And at that point, Napoleon hadn't become the emperor. He hadn't betrayed the revolution. He was the great leader of the revolution. Liberty, fraternity, equality. Wow, that was pretty heady stuff. Some of the earlier tourists who visited Malta reported on how repressive the regime was, how the knights oppressed the local nobility, how the Catholic Church oppressed anybody they could get their hands on, and how the whole idea of freedom and human dignity was really a rare idea on Malta in that situation. So wholeheartedly, they embraced the French Revolution, which means that, oh yeah, Nappy, come on ashore. Oops. Napoleon's idea of spreading the revolution was to gather up everything of value on the island, melt it down, and pay for his ships, arms, horses, and cannons to conquer Egypt? You know, 6 days, he sails away. Totally changes Malta forever. The Knights are no longer a sovereign state. They are French territory now, except the French could care less. They have their own problems over the next 15 or 20 years. Oh, and guess what? In the midst of all this turmoil, here come the British. And we have a whole new regime and a whole new situation happening. Let's jump back to Cagliostro for a second. Whatever Cagliostro learned, whether or not he was Pinto's illegitimate son, he was privy to the secret society. And Cagliostro's work from the early 1770s right up until the moment he was hanged or poisoned or stabbed, we're not really sure which, in Rome in 1795, he worked for one thing: the dissolution of the ancient regimes, the dissolutions of king and church and society as it existed on a feudal level, and the promotion of a new society based on, wow, a novel idea, merit. That if you were smart, if you were productive, if you had good scientific ideas, then you should be the leaders of society. And this was all encompassed in the Freemasonic ideals. Has anybody read War and Peace? Okay. War and Peace, a long, tedious Russian novel, has 13 chapters in the middle of it that is the finest explication of Freemasonry ever written. Freemasonry in its sense of ushering in a new society, its sense of trying to create a new age. Now, of course, Napoleon is the backdrop of that, the invasion of Russia, and that's the end of the story. Before Napoleon, and the reason why Napoleon was able to become Napoleon, was the fact that just knocking off the old kings wasn't enough. That in that vacuum that resulted from the fall of the King of France, etc., stepped in a whole new element. And that element was so new that we're only now beginning to understand what that means in terms of revolution. Whenever you have an overturning of an entrenched social order with no good alternative presented, then extremists, both of future extremists, we want to change everything radically, and counter extremists of we want to change everything back, clash head to head. And this is what happened in the disaster called the French Revolution. And the result of that clashing head to head was Napoleon, a very clever man who took advantage of the confusion and essentially made himself emperor. When Napoleon fell apart, could not maintain his empire, everything reverted back to the old order. And that lasted a few more years. And you had the Revolution of 1848, and that fell apart. Then that sort of stabilized for a while, and then you had the rise of the German state in the 1870s. Europe reshuffled again. You had World War I, it reshuffled again. You had World War II, it reshuffled again. Now we have Americans. And now you sort of have the present. Along the way, we had the Russian Revolution, which was sort of an outgrowth in a very strange way of both the French Revolution and the revolutions of 1848, which Marx was a witness to. And the Russian Revolution proved the dictum again, that just simply overthrowing the old order without having something coherent to put in its place allows the extremist in both directions to fight for control. And the most brutal, strongest, ruthless of those ideologies will always win out. So, the moral to the story is that we're in the midst of one of these new age transformations at the moment. Everyone can see that the society, the civilization that we've built up around us is going through one of these sea changes, one of these tidal waves of change. But no one has a good idea of what we should do if and when all of this falls apart. The apocalyptic vision of, oh, okay, we're going to have a Carrington event and we'll lose all electronics and so forth, you know, that might be a good idea. Okay? That might be a good thing by comparison. By comparison, as the new age takes hold, as we are forced into a new way of thinking, the extremists are fighting it out. Christian extremists, Muslim extremists. Now, if one of these two groups of extremists went out, we might think we would be lucky to have a Carrington event. We might have a new thermonuclear war. We might have new varieties of inquisitions and auto-da-fés, and mankind might descend into a dark age that would make the one, say, 1,000 years ago look like a picnic. Now, I want to be hopeful. I'm essentially an optimist, even though I am a historian, which means that if you're a historian, you know all the bad things, okay, as well as the good things. But we have to be mindful of the fact that as we have this revolution in consciousness, this revolution in technology, that there has to be planning, there has to be an idea that reaches a common middle ground so the extremists don't have a way to take control. And my sort of simple solution is we just simply think of everybody as part of the same unit. We're all just humans. And in fact, we'll take it a level even more basic. We're all just monkeys too smart for our own good. All right? We're all just muddling through. We're all just trying to get by. And essentially, every smart monkey on the planet wants the same thing. If I ask each of you individually, what would you want? Oh, well, a peaceful life, a way to do some useful work, see my family grow up, decent food. Okay, that sounds good. Let's do that. Right? And perhaps that's the point of these various revolutions, is that we're trying to find that middle ground so that we don't have another 30 Years' War, so that we don't have another French Revolution, Russian Revolution, World War II, etc. Because we are in that moment of maximum change. It's changing so fast that we don't even have any real way to keep up with it. So I have no idea how long I've talked. Have we hit 2 hours yet?
No. It was rich.
Maybe.
An hour? Wow, I'm talking fast.
We were talking fast. I'm thinking of take a steak somewhere.
And then questions, perhaps.
Sure. Yes.
What do you think about the whole transhumanism movement and the idea that we should be going off-planet and this type of thing, that our destiny is in the stars, etc.?
Well, did you ever see the movie Independence Day?
Yeah.
Well, that's what will happen when we go off planet if we don't solve the problems here. We'll just be the same sort of predators we've always been. I mean, look what happened to South America. Same thing. We either solve it here or we really don't deserve to go anywhere else.
But don't you think without a vision, people perish? They have to have some kind of long-range vision to work toward. Rather than just simply, I want to take care of myself and my own family. You have to kind of bump out the responsibility.
What's wrong with I want to take care of myself and my own family?
Nothing wrong with that.
And I want to take care of everybody else's
But
family.
you take care of everybody else too.
In other words,
So you need a bigger vision than
right.
just taking care of.
And isn't the bigger vision simply to stop wars, stop fighting over beliefs, stop fighting over resources, and cooperate? I mean, that's a pretty good vision to me. In other words, there's no point in trying to go off planet if we can't solve the planets here. We'll just export them.
I mean, that's just one of the things. They believe in a technological paradise, in which you'll have programmable matter, which is a form of transmutation of base matter into something
Yeah.
more refined.
Yeah, we could have replicators. Who knows? I really think that at the moment, if we had replicators, the only thing we'd replicate would be, old TV shows and pornography. So, it's like the internet, Human beings are human beings, right? Yes?
I just wanted to know if you had any information about the role of Garibaldi. Garibaldi, the leader of the,
Oh, yes.
the revolution, because he brought together the two big Masonic houses in Italy, and he was also linked to Malta.
Yes?
Maybe, there was some kind of linkage.
That's a little bit out of my time period. I don't do well in the 19th century. It's too recent. I much prefer the 16th. But yes, Garibaldi was a Mason, and he was actually in league with the House of Savoy, who have been foes of the Catholic Church for over 1,000 years. And it was a good attempt, but in Italy, you'll never do away with the church. So that's kind of the problem there. And the same thing happened. In other words, in the fallout from World War I, the most ruthless, rises to the top. And Il Duce.
Vincent, could I suggest, you had mentioned intriguingly a theme which our audience here is not familiar about, when you said the secret of some mysterious John who may have been John the Divine or John the Baptist.
Okay.
The audience here doesn't know that Vincent just led a tour of Saint-Remy in South France, in which the central theme was maybe.
Yes. Who is this mysterious Saint John that these guys are the knights of?
And if I may, the reason I'm excited to see this discussed is because John, Eon, Xion, to branch perfectly means fractality, so I admit to having a bit of agenda here. Sorry, please.
One of the peculiar sort of little points here is the prominence of Provence. And again, one of the few auberges of the knights still left, it's now the Archaeological Museum, is the auberge of Provence. So the influence of Provence on the Knights of St. John, whether or not they were actually founded there, is enormous. And it boils down to exactly who St. John might be. Now, that's not necessarily part of the alchemical secret. That's part of that second secret, the secret of physical transmutation. Remember I said the Tibetan idea of attaining your diamond body, Padmasambhava? Padmasambhava, in attaining his diamond body, was able to generate such charge that he could melt the rock and squeeze his hand in it like Clark Gable in wet cement on Hollywood Boulevard. Okay. And it's pretty amazing. It's not carved. I've been there. I've stuck my little pudgy handprint in it. And he did it.
He melted the stone.
Melted the stone and left such a charge on the mountainside where he melted the stone that miraculous events to this day happen spontaneously. In fact, a little bit further down the mountain, there's a Ganesha shrine that has about an 8-inch high image of White Tara, a Tibetan bodhisattva, emerging from the stone. And over time, over the course of years, you can actually see it getting sharper and clearer. And nobody's carving it. Nobody's working it. It's simply coming out of the stone. So that's the kind of energy we're talking about. Now, in the West, we don't have any exemplars like that. In other words, we talk about Christianity and Jesus, and okay, he was a great teacher, and yes, he rose from the dead, maybe, but we don't have any direct exemplar to say, okay, other than being God's son, how do you attain transformation, transcendence? Well, it turns out, remember I mentioned those Cathars, who are the Christian version of the Shia. Turns out that we do have some of those. It's just that the Catholic Church killed them all.
Oh, the usual.
Ah, yes. Cherchez la film, cherchez la Catholics. Okay. In southern France, very soon after the crucifixion, a group of Jesus' family, including Mary Magdalene, probably his wife, her sister Martha, their mother-in-law, or Joseph's mother, and the mother of two of the disciples, along with Lazarus, St. Maximin, and St. Sidonius, all arrived in southern France, a little area called St. Marie de la Mer. And apparently, Mary Magdalene was pregnant with Jesus' son and gave birth in a cave down the road at the ancient city of Glanum.
Which Vincent led us on a tour of, which was amazing.
And even more amazing is that we were able actually to find it because Leonardo da Vinci was privileged to the secret and did a painting called The Virgin of the Rocks, which shows the cave very clearly.
And he showed us the viewpoint there that shows up in the painting. In the cave.
So, this particular individual is shown in several places, and we were able to follow a lot of those on the ground in Provence, as either Saint John or Saint Trophime, the Holy Triumph, Holy Trophy. And it's recorded, in fact, this month's copy of Sacred Planet magazine in France, in French, has an article that hits a lot of the same things we were doing, but without connecting the dots. And it even mentions the story I'm about to tell you. Saint Trophime was supposedly so holy, according to the later legends, that Jesus himself came down from heaven and left a miraculous knee print in a coffin lid in the Ala Champs in Arles. Or Saint Trophime himself attained his diamond body like Padmasambhava and left his own knee print. Now, Leonardo da Vinci painted another painting called St. John the Baptist, or St. John in the Wilderness, or St. John as Dionysus, that shows an individual sitting on a particular spot up on the mountain with 3 rocky islands in the background, and his left knee prominently thrust out, and a rod pointing to the place, and he's pointing in the famous Da Vinci gesture back over his shoulder towards Glenham. So Da Vinci was one of these people that also knew this particular secret. St. John, interestingly enough, apparently attained his enlightenment meditating in a hypogeum. Now, the connection between Malta and southern France is very obscure, but roughly 1,000 years after the hypogeum and the temples here, someone was building hypogeums and some pretty bizarre temples in the region around Arles, those 3 rocky islands in Leonardo's paintings. And much later, a couple of thousand years later, John, St. Trophimus, meditated in those caves in this hypogeum and attained a certain degree of enlightenment. Now, one of the sources we have that perhaps relates to this individual is one of Malta's favorite people, St. Paul. You remember St. Paul was on his way to Rome because he'd gotten into a lot of trouble in Jerusalem. Well, the trouble he got into in Jerusalem was because of this fellow called the Egyptian, who was some sort of foreign Jew, and there is a connection from very ancient times between this region in southern France and Egypt, as there is connection between very ancient times between Malta and Egypt. And this fellow was known in Acts of the Apostle, as the Egyptian. He arrived in Jerusalem preaching a whole new form of Christianity. Paul challenged him to a duel with words in the temple courtyard. It descended into a melee. Paul was arrested. He declared before the governor that he was a Roman citizen, so the governor shipped him off to Rome. And on his way to Rome, he was shipwrecked on Malta, etc.
And the rest is history.
The rest is church history. So, say what? Yeah. So St. Paul and Luke, whoever Luke was, describes this fellow as being a foreign, perhaps Egyptian Jew, who arrived in Jerusalem, did not win against St. Paul, and left with a large number of pre-diaspora Jews back from wherever he came from. Now, we know it's not Alexandria, so where did he come from? The probability is, given the date, that they were going to southern France. And this little region of southern France, from the time of Caligula's cousin, Germanicus, who was the brother-in-law of Caesar Tiberius, if I'm not mistaken. He invited all the Jews from Palestine who wanted to immigrate to this region of southern France. The idea was that they would increase trade, that they could build their own little temple, and therefore they wouldn't have to send all that money to the temple in Palestine. You know, by the way, we'll get rid of some of these troublesome Jews so Palestine won't bubble over. That was moderately successful. So in southern France, you had this little colony of Jews right next to the Proto-Celtic Ligurians and the Greeks and then the Romans. Really a cosmopolitan mix. And that mix was overwhelmingly Christian, but a Christian of a different variety, by around 50 AD. And the date for the Egyptians' arrival in Jerusalem is 56 AD. So by the time Paul got stranded on Malta, there was already a large community of Christians around the family of Jesus in southern France. And perhaps the Egyptian was our mysterious St. John, St. Trophimus, who left his knee print.
And so Sarah the Egyptian, is that Egyptian?
Yes, the gypsies in Provence, to this day, have a saint called Saint Sarah. And it's a huge festival where all the gypsies come, and they take the relics of Saint Sarah and the relics of the two Marys down to the sea and then back to the church. And it's quite an event. We were just there for it.
Would have been the blue-black Egyptian somehow. Maybe,
well, blood is always blue if you have a white skin to see it from inside. But yeah, we don't know necessarily what color he was. Now, the connection to what we're talking about is that both the Templars and the Knights of St. John focused on one of these St. Johns, either St. John the Baptist or St. John the Evangelist, as their special figure, so that their feast day of St. John to both of these orders was very prominent. And considering the cover story about the order of St. John starting in Provence, even though the person that it was claimed as the founder didn't exist, we find no trace of him, we can perhaps say that the St. John of Jerusalem is the same as the Egyptian that St. Paul had the brawl with. And in that case, this particular branch of the crusading orders were the ones who protected that particular quality of the secret. In fact, the secret Masonic order that is recognized as the first Masonic order here on Malta was the Order of St. John the Secret and the Harmony. So it's like the harmonious secret of St. John? What could that be? Now, the confusion is over which St. John, but they're really looking in the wrong direction. It could be this St. John from Provence. And it could be, again, if you wanted to start a secret society around a tradition that was very old and predated Christianity, went back to a better source than the Catholic Church, then what better source could you have than this provincial true Christianity? Now, the Cathars apparently were also in on the secret. They had a book written by a St. John called the Book of Love that we know had some passages that may have been part of the Gospel of John, which seems to be a first-person description of the events in Palestine. And we also have several other bits of this book that we know about that tend to point to some pretty heretical ideas. Now, the Cathars, of course, were simplicity itself compared to the church. In those days in Provence, we're talking the 12th century or so, late 12th century, early 13th century. The priests were corrupt. They were as bad as the rulers or worse. They oppressed the serfs. They owned land. They would only occasionally perform masses. You had to pay to be buried, and then you had to pay for them to light candles for your soul, etc. Whereas the perfecti, the Cathar priest, lived in poverty, lived among the people, taught spirituality, practiced healing, never charged any money. And below them were various ranks of lay people who could participate in the spiritual experience at various levels. Now, the Catholic Church thought that this was way too good of a thing, and that, again, southern France was just way too rich and abundant and had way too much prosperity and freedom and free thinking. So 1208, over a minor scuffle over another papal legate, similar to the 30 Years' War, the Pope declared a crusade against the Cathars in southern France. And over the course of the next 30 years or so, more people were killed in southern France than were killed in, say, World War I. And to this day, regions of Languedoc, from Provence all the way across the Pyrenees, are depopulated. Some of those villages have never come back to their 12th century level. And as you drive through the region, you find all these half-deserted villages, ruined castles up on the mountaintop, and so forth. It's like a sort of a ghost town. And the center of all that is a very strange town of Carcassonne. That's where it all started. And it was marched on by Simon de Montfort, who was sort of the bad guy in charge. And first they wiped out everyone in that region, and then they just continued spreading until in 1244 the last little group of the Cathars were trapped on a mountain called Montségur, and rather than be killed by the Romans, the Catholics, they were martyrs. They marched down and jumped into the bonfire all by themselves. Now you have to ask yourself, what kind of religion is it that would have that kind of fervor that you could march down the mountain and jump in the bonfire? Well, it's a religion that preaches love and peace and just what we were talking about. We're all one people. We all have the same values. And also believes in reincarnation. And you have to ask yourself as well, what kind of religion would it be that would make all those people march down the mountain and jump into the bonfire. So in the long run, Catholicism has a lot to answer for. But all of these threads do seem to interweave around the Knights of St. John.
And just the 1 minute that the stone that John melted with his knee became the Grail.
Well, that may be the origin point of all the Holy Grail stories.
Or the four objects. This is what Vincent taught us in France. You see, the origin of the Grail is part of this.
So, any other questions? Or Dan, do you have another topic you'd like for me to start on? Yes.
The stone became a plaque.
You've ever thought of this in the biblical stories, that the knee is a euphemism for the penis.
Yes.
So it is actually the origin of...
And it is in the Grail story as well. It is in the Grail stories as well. The Fisher King is wounded in his thigh.
Right, the thigh with Jacob and the
Yeah,
angel.
same thing.
So maybe it's...
And again, there are descendants, you know, Jesus wasn't just a special case or, you know, gay, you know, that he had a wife and had a family. So you had what?
I was going to say, I was in Ethiopia for a while, and they have a very strong belief there that the Ark of the Covenant was brought over to Ethiopia,
Aksum.
and that there's a town there which was probably directed and engineered, and the building of it was directed by the Templars, because the level of engineering is such that they cannot imagine how it could have been conceived otherwise. It's called Lalibela. I don't know if you've...
Yeah, I've read.
They compare it to the cathedral in Chartres, in the sort of level of engineering prowess.
Yeah, I've read Graham Hancock's book. I actually met Graham a few times. If there was such a thing as the Ark, it probably ended up in Ethiopia. But the jury's still out on exactly who built all those structures. But yeah, I mean, that's quite conceivable to me. If you look on some of the temples in Egypt, it's really easy to trace who the Queen of Sheba was, and she was probably Ethiopian, the land of Punt. I see Alfred standing up with...
Well, my question is, since you have been in Malta and today in Belgium, have you found something that enlighten us? I mean,
Well, I think I found a really nice place to retire. Is that what you mean?
well, no. I've also decided to retire there this morning.
No,
I mean, I don't know anything about history, but really, you captured my attention all the way through. The sound of your voice, as if you lived it yourself.
well, you know,
It's something which you feel.
you want to talk about how Valletta looked in the 18th century?
Sorry?
You want to talk about how Valletta looked to the 18th century and how the arch... I mean, I'm teasing.
He remembers.
But Gozo was really amazing. You know, Malta is just really amazing. It's this odd mixture of Eastern influences and just this strange Baroque fantasy land. It's just awesome. Now the temples, I'm going to talk a little bit more tomorrow after we see a few more of them. Let me just say that so far I found nothing to disprove the thesis that I came in here with, and a lot to talk about on that thesis. But as I talk so fast tonight, I got to have something for tomorrow, otherwise I'm just going to...
Well, why don't you say what your subject tomorrow is?
Well, tomorrow we're going to talk about what really are these things. You know, what are they for? Why are they here? Who built them? From an archaeological point of view, I'm not an outer space Atlantean kind of guy. However, I still am not that fond of the outer space hypothesis. However, I must say, standing in front of the Giants Temple today and looking around at a couple of other places, you know, Atlantis might not be a bad hypothesis. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Vincent, would you like to go a bit more controversial a bit later and tie the Brits back into the story here?
Well, no, I wouldn't, but I thought I was controversial enough revealing the most successful secret society in history. and that it started right here, and it's still going on, by the way. Yes.
I'm just excited that we're in the midst of history right now.
Oh yeah, everybody is.
This is going to be a lot of change.
Yeah, oh yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested in the transformation that took place in the alchemical tradition between the search for the philosopher's stone, and you briefly brought in the idea of monoatomic gold. And there's still a whole school of people today that believe that monoatomic gold can bring some sort of immortality, physical immortality, as opposed to spiritual transformation. And so there was this changeover from a group of scientists who are earnestly trying to recreate possibly monoatomic gold for lengthening of life rather than to create wealth. And from that it transformed into this idea that alchemy is all about personal transformation on a spiritual level. So I wonder whether you could say a little bit about this changeover. Who were the people responsible for the changeover? Do you think the changeover was made in order to conceal again, in order to conceal the true mission that
Okay,
they had?
let me start with that one. No. That whole process that you're talking about is to conceal the fact that they don't have what they think they have, and they really don't know what they're talking about. Okay, monatomic gold, in the Egyptian sense, is a byproduct of the transmutational process. And again, it will strengthen your aura, strengthen your electrical field, increase your immune system, have some healthy benefits. But I would not recommend eating either mummy dust or monatomic gold. In other words, that's sort of a shortcut. And the Egyptians didn't eat it, okay? They produced it. So eating it, being exposed to it, is probably not a good thing. In fact, Dan used to carry a little bag of it around and would pass it around and see how creepy everybody felt. So it's not a good thing, okay? But it's,
dangerous.
yeah, it's one of those things that are demonstration of the theory. In other words, the fact that mummy dust and the fact that we can reproduce it as monatomic gold, that we can do that, suggests that, okay, there is something to the theory. But actually being able to cause a substance to jump its electronic shell, its atomic shell, is a whole different subject.
It's about charge collapse, and that is what we do this weekend.
Yes.
Where Vincent
Dan will tell you more about
talking
that.
about, it's actually vaporized gold or palladium that's in the meteoritic glass, and the dielectric quality, the electric field of that glass, is the key. That's the clue. That is where we go to science.
Okay, and in fact, I'll explain a little bit more of that. It's not enough just to have the glass. It's not enough just to, you know, insert the palladium in an infusion in gas and seal it in glass or whatever. The Venetian glassmakers tried that in the Middle Ages. That's how you got the beautiful red stained glass, was vaporizing gold and, you know, inserting that into the glass. That's not going to do it. If you start off with one of these meteoritic substances, you've got to keep in mind that we know about beryllium, and we know roughly what was in the cobblestone because of the color. But we do not have any good chemical analysis for why moldavite is green. It ain't copper, okay? It's not copper sulfide. It's nothing that would normally produce a green. And the blue version of moldavite, which is very rare and only found in a small section, really seems to be very odd, that we have no idea what those heavy metals could be. We could be looking at something iridium, rhodium, or even stranger, some sort of unstable half-life. What we do know is that if you take that and you subject it to heat in a place where multiple magnetic lines cross.
The symmetry of which is rich.
Yes. And there are very few places where that happens naturally. It usually is formed, like in Egypt, where a lot of people over a long period of time have worked with these lines that will produce one of these crossing vortexes. Now, the reason why Kelly stumbled onto this was not just that he discovered the blue form of moldavite. Their benefactor, when Rudolph II threw them out of Prague, a fellow by the name of Willem Rosenberg, had an old castle down in southern Bohemia at a little place, you're going to love this, called Magdalena Springs. And there is a chapel there from the early 11th century, 1035, 150 years before the Magdalene cult emerged in southern France, that is directly on the crossing of 4 very powerful magnetic lines. Plus it has a vault that's shaped like a torus. Dan will have a lot more to say about toruses, but it's shaped like a torus. And they worked, their alchemical laboratory was in this vault underneath the church. So whether they were aware of that, whether that's the reason why they moved in with Rosenberg at the old castle or not, that's the combination of stuff that produced the powder of projection. Now it could be that when the Templars discovered the Mecca stone, they also discovered a Hebrew manuscript, and there are a couple of candidates for at least part of this, that would explain to them how you create magnetic lines from the rising and setting of certain stars, or how you find these magnetic lines from the rising and setting of certain stars, and that you do your transformation at those places. And we do know the Templars were in a lot of very strange places. And we do know from dowsing and geomagnetic work on some of their commanderies and chapels that they tended to choose very interesting places, and that they also built octagonally, 8 sides. Now the 8-sided structure is again connected with the Magdalene. And at the Madalena Chapel in southern Bohemia, you have 4 lines making 8. Okay? And if you look at the Maltese cross, what do you see?
8 points.
8 points. So that whole secret is sort of wrapped around each other. But you need one of these crossing points to spark it.
We're going to talk about how lasers create conjugation and self-organization, and the picture of that is the Maltese cross, literally.
So if you have one of these geomagnetic spots, and you're working with this very, very heavy metal rich and very energetic substance, the prima materia, in that situation with heat, and again, human concentration, you have to bring to bear the laser-like focus, okay? Now, in Kelly's case, it was, oh, Jesus, we have to do this or we're never going to get out of here alive. And that sort of pressure does cause you to focus. You know? So that kind of focus, the magnetic lines on the proper substance, made it pop, for want of a better word, and created the powder of projection, or the philosopher's stone. And as long as you didn't touch it, as long as it wasn't contaminated, just a very small kernel of it was enough to change a large quantity of base metal, any kind of base metal, and bump its atomic structure up to gold. Now, it's not a literal substance, it's a catalyst.
It's an electric field generator.
Yeah, it's something that works directly on the atomic level
And it is
of the atom.
It's also bioactive, and we'll be discussing more about that as well.
The bioactive capacity is where the idea of long life comes in. And again, Cagliostro claimed to be 6,000 years old in his better days.
Yes, but if we go back to the Bible, they mention quite a few people who are very, very long.
That's right.
And really all of this originated in Egypt, did it not? Because when Moses left Egypt, he took with him the secrets of the Egyptians. So that whatever was contained in the Ark of the Covenant, many people believe today it was something that he brought away with him from Egypt.
It could have been one of the meteoritic bin-bins. The pyramidions, the little small pyramids on top of some of their ceremonial obelisk, like the one at On or Heliopolis, was known to be meteoritic. I actually own a piece of the bin from the Zozer's pyramid at Saqqara. There was a high altar there with a pyramidion and obelisk that was connected to Heliopolis and then connected to Giza. And we were just lucky enough to be kicking around in the stone one day and picked up a piece of it. And it is very dark green. It's like the deepest, richest moldavite you've ever seen. Very dense, very heavy. And it does have some sort of electric charge. So maybe the Egyptians made use of it. Maybe that was part of the secret that Moses stole. Maybe there was just a really hot glass meteorite inside the Ark of the Covenant.
But also, we can't forget that the atmosphere may have been different earlier on Earth, and there may have been a canopy that protected us from harmful rays.
Well, we're not talking that early. I mean, you know, we know that the atmosphere from, you know, say the 18th century BCE was roughly the same as ours. We don't have any special pleading on that. You know, we can do things like core samples and so forth. Now, if we want to talk 13,000 years ago, yeah, there's changes back there, but
Pre-Diluvian story, so all
Right.
around the world
Right.
suggests that the canopy collapsed.
well, I don't know about that, but yeah. Anyway, in the historical times that we're talking about, the atmosphere was much the same.
So on this weekend, we're going to go into much more detail from the electrical engineering viewpoint, what that electric field is, why it causes seed germination and human bliss, and its relation to diffusion, which starts with the symmetry of the charge collapse that is gold. So we start with that. That's what the physics we start with this weekend, really. But I'm not a historian. I can't mention a single date, but the physics I can.
Yes, Alfred.
Another question came to mind. So with all these changes in the elements and 2012 regulation,
A nice Dominican in skirts scaring the crap out of school children. And what was he telling them? Oh, Mary Magdalene wasn't a small sinner. She was such a sinner. She had to live in the stank cave, wrapped in nothing but her hair, and crying all the time before she could be forgiven for having a sex life. I mean, really. You know, it's like, don't those guys know you go to hell for telling lies? You know. So I really don't think the church is going to apologize for that one. But if we get lucky, there might not be any Catholic church. In which case, there'd be a lot of artwork up for sale. You know, a lot of nice spaces for theaters and parties.
And they might give the money back to the witches, you know.
Yeah, really. You know, that would be good. Repatriation to everyone who could prove they're a descendant of the 60 million women killed by the witch cult.
So this has been a public relations effort for the Catholic Church.
Yes.
Le Beau.
Le Baume.
Yeah, I went there. I went there to the chapel.
Oh, yeah.
There was a book, and it was signed by Leonardo da Vinci also.
Huh?
There were signatures in this book open in the chapel.
Da Vinci signed it.
Well, I haven't seen that.
Because I was seeing the signatures, and that's the one that's
Wow.
picked, because I knew who he was. The others, I mean, but
I didn't see a book up there, but I will admit to being rather put off by the Dominicans. Also, it was a really rough
it
climb.
was a quiet day.
It was a really rough climb. So,
Well,
any other questions?
There's a really nice picture down in the cathedral too, which shows St. John kneeling on the stone as a child. And the view behind that is quite interesting too. So when you get yourself down there, the profile behind looks awful like some places we've been lately.
Well, alrighty then. We'll have to go see that. Another piece of the puzzle falls into place.
so
Any other questions?
We're very grateful that you came, Vincent, and hope people come tomorrow.
We'll continue. Yes.
You mentioned the secret societies before,
Yes?
and you mentioned them in the context of them having a vision,
Mm-hmm.
a vision which inspires revolutions and which inspired change. However, today the idea of secret societies and Illuminati has a very obscure connotation in the sense that they speak of a new world order, they speak of humanity which is becoming robotic
Mm-hmm.
and brainwashed, and so these two ideas seem to be conflicting.
Remember, any secret society you've heard about has failed.
Has failed.
Has anybody in here heard about the 23 candidates and Grandmaster Pinto? Anybody heard of that before I said it? Now that is a successful secret society. And there's the boys who are still moving us toward a better future.
So you mean that underlying there is a vision. This vision
Right.
still there.
Right.
But what about what we see, conspiracies we hear about?
Those are all failed conspiracies.
Failed
If you hear about them, they're no longer secret. Okay? And there have been, just like the Illuminati was founded to fight the inner order. Okay? So all of these other conspiracies, Skull and Bones, Illuminati, whatever, are rip-offs. They're ways to confuse the issue or steal some of the authority by confusing people. But everybody knows who the real initiates are. They're the ones that you never see. They're the ones who never take credit. They're the ones who are always out there doing something for the benefit of humanity, but they're anonymous. We don't know who they are. Those are the good guys. All the rest of them are just crap. Yes?
Are you an alchemist?
Am I an alchemist? Not in this lifetime. Don't practice anymore.
You were.
I didn't say that.
When you were Kelly.
What?
When you were Kelly.
No, I didn't say that either. Although you can see some stuff on Czech TV that might give you that idea.
Have you paid a visit to the National Library?
Here?
Yes, here.
No, no. I've only been here 2-3 days. How long has it
Are you
been?
planning?
Well, I'm definitely planning to come back. And I've known for a long time that I absolutely had to see the megalithic structures here. I'm a megalithomaniac, okay? Truly. So it's like I knew I had to see these structures sometime. And over the past, 20 years or so, it's become more and more likely that all roads point to Malta and the Knights of St. John. The deeper I got into the Grail story, the more it turns up. Just like Dan was saying. Who is that St. John? Oh, he has a group of knights. Oh, okay. So, no, I haven't been to the National Archives. If anybody is a knight of Malta in good standing and would like to get me into the archives, I have some things I would really love to look for.
You can just go, they're there.
Really? They're just... I'm talking about the good stuff.
Wearing away.
I'm talking about the good stuff.
Can I ask a question of the group? I did go down there the other day.
The
I
knights.
was looking for a
They have the same temple.
1970 times of Malta around
Really?
And there are knights in more.
The picture that was discovered, and as best as I can find out, it was held in Serbia, and that was wanting to repatriate it to Malta. So, but they hit a wall. Nobody wanted to talk to it. But the picture is the picture of John of the Knights. Yeah, St. John of the Knights. But I don't know if anyone knows anything about that. I'm really interested. Yes.
Well, all these little clues are here. And I will say this about the British. They just were so not with it that they managed to preserve everything and not screw it up. You know, which you got to admire that, you know. Yes?
I have this curiosity because you spoke about Edward Kelly,
Uh-huh.
that he contemplated the angels.
Uh-huh.
What are the angels? Who are the angels? Where do they come from?
Simply put, they are the essence of intelligence inside your DNA. Your DNA has enough storage capacity to record every event that ever happened on a galactic level. So there has to be some information retrieval system. So what we're talking about in terms of angels in the D and Kelly sense, I'm not talking about any religious things, but those angels are literally the intelligence behind your DNA. And frankly, the intelligence behind your DNA would just love for our DNA to survive and evolve. They would be quite willing. Yes, here's a copy. It's only out in Italian, but this is the book I just did.
The pictures will tell us.
It'll soon be out in English.
You know, they've just developed artificial DNA.
Well, I've heard that, and I'll have to sort of see a little bit more about that one.
This month.
I'd have to see a little bit more about that.
At the TED Talks, you know, the TED Talks. Yeah.
Soullessness.
Golems. That's a whole nother Prague story, building golems, yes.
Stephen King has published published a very beautiful book of the Enochian tables.
Say that again?
Stephen King has published a beautiful book with all the Enochian...
You mean Francis King?
Francis King, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, Francis King.
Stephen King would give it a whole different aspect.
Of the Enochian tables that Dee worked on. But I've never come across what you said earlier, that mathematicians have been working on them to actually make sense of the tables. As far as I was aware, nobody has actually ever made any sense of these tables.
That's not entirely true, but Dan and I have done pretty good. That's the thrust of the new book, is demonstrating the connection to DNA and mathematics and so forth.
And it's in Italian?
It's in Italian first. We had to sort of go with the publisher that wanted it, and as we make money, we'll translate it into other languages: English, French, Czech.
You just said something about creating golems. I mean, do you think that might be a scary possibility?
Well,
You kind of toss it off, but it actually...
Well, soulless beings, that's what artificial DNA would be. The legend of the golem is actually another one of those proofs of principles to alchemy, because Rabbi Lowe took river sand from the Vatavla, and he and 6 other Hebrew sages infused it with the divine resonance and brought it to life. Yeah, although interestingly enough, Mary Shelley had never heard of the golem legend when she wrote Frankenstein. It's like parallel ideas, but yeah, and of course it was a soulless beast, cyborg, something like that. And if you didn't, it was charged by having the Shema HaForesh, the 42-letter name of God, under its tongue, and the word Amet, or truth, on its forehead. So the way you put it to sleep is you erase the A out of Amet, and then it was Met, which is death. So truth when it's awake, death when it's not awake. And the story is Rabbi Lowe forgot to erase the A one Sabbath, and so the golem went out on his own when everybody was at synagogue and had a little good old Praguian drinking and debauchery, and they had to catch him and hold him down and erase the A. So
an Enochian vocabulary alphabet, you'd be able to apply like I think that language emerges from our biology.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's right.
Ostensibly,
our DNA actually is a language. It has syntax and grammar.
Ostensibly, you could vocalize that like through cymatics or something. Maybe.
Just simply saying Enochian causes changes at the level of your DNA. That's a much longer discussion. We could maybe do a little of that tomorrow or whatever. But that's one of the things that I've been doing on this apocalyptic missionary journey, is I've been teaching the basic Enochian stuff in various places. I hadn't included Malta because I really didn't realize until a couple of weeks before we left that this is where we'd end up. So this is sort of the gravy on about a 6-week-long expedition. This is the goodie for the trip. So. But yeah, the angels dictated the Enochian language backwards so that Dee and Kelly wouldn't accidentally say something and set off something that they didn't want to happen. So it's very powerful. Very powerful.
Tetragrammaton.
Well, Tetragrammaton is Hebrew.
That's the same.
Basic principle. Hebrew is local. Enochian seems to be higher dimensional and cosmic. It's at a different level, and it has a different set of geometries. For instance, Hebrew unpacks into a cube octa, which is very local, very surface thing. Enochian unpacks into a very complex 4-dimensional structure called the 24-cell figure, which is 5 hypercubes moving inside out and out of each other, which if you think that's complicated, so.
With Mei Wan Ho, the biologist, she talks about...
Oh yes, Mei Wan Ho, yes. The DNA connection with the I Ching and the sound phonemes. Oh yes, I reference Dr. Pop and Mei Wan Ho quite a bit in all of this work. Excellent stuff. And my wife Darlene, who's a calligrapher, discovered that the Enochian language has the same number of little tornadoes or conic sections as there are phonemes recordable from DNA. So there is some direct connection between being able to say the Enochian words and vibrate them and communicate with your DNA. So communicating with your angels may just simply be communicating with a higher intelligence inside your DNA. No UFOs required, isn't that great? Us monkeys, we have all the information we need right inside each cell. Okay, well, we'll wrap it up for today.
So, now, tomorrow we have another talk here, and I would like you to inform Alexia, who is coming tomorrow, and Dan is going to speak about a 3-day seminar we have on Saturday all day between 9 and 5, Sunday between 9 and 1, and Monday between 9 and 1. Dan is going to say what it is all about before we leave.
Just a quickie.
Just a quickie.
But, I mean, it's ironic here we end with the discussion of the physics of language, because that's kind of where we start. We animate the physics of the origin of Hebrew and the compression algorithm that becomes how DNA absorbs charge, actually. And we look at the electric field that DNA makes, which is more blackboard content, and why that's self-organizing, what physics uses the language for that. So we talked about the sacred geometry in science for many of the things we've discussed this evening. And also we happen to have, because we've been doing this for 30 years, some of the best visuals and computer animations of sacred geometry in planet, actually, obviously public. And so we'd love to see you, and also anyone you friends that are interested in the connection between science and spirituality, science and religion, science and consciousness. So Saturday we do the science. Sunday we might do some of the biofeedback where we measure heart and brain waves, measure empathy, love, and with brain waves we measure bliss process by measuring golden ratio in brain waves. And then Monday, or one of those days, we'll do the biologic architecture, where we'll discuss the science of living architecture, how you make a building that creates the electric field that causes seed germination and bliss, which has everything to do with what we've been discussing this evening, actually. So it's a fun time playing with science and consciousness. Yes, thank you, Valerie. So one of the things that we've done is we've created a whole line of new technologies called fractalfield.com, actually, also with the help of Roger, breakthrough-technologies.com, which take these ideas about implosion, fractality, phase conjugation, non-destructive compression, and created a whole line of technologies, for example, water purification, hydrodynamic implosion, magnetic implosion, and actually the gold cups, and we have them, you can play with them, where you're going to feel the kind of electric field that this projected powder would have made. And when you put them by your head, you feel what it does to your attention, actually. You begin to imagine why, our ancestors knew how to make an electric field that not only helped create bliss and seed germination, but prevented aging, which is really sort of the physics of what Dolman structures are in my humble view. So we're going to talk about that science, and we have some gadgets you can play with and experience. And also we'll show the water purification technologies and things like that. So lots of fun. We're glad that Roger did this too. So, and thank you for bringing us here.
So I would like to thank Vincent Bridges for what he told us, for his energy, for his patience.
Heavy mystery.
And even Dan, and Roger, and Darlene, and Valerie. So please, I would like you to inform Alexia, whoever is coming on Saturday, because we would like to know the numbers. And if you have any friends, let them know.